bear with me. I'll try to be concise. And I count on you, Susie, to tell me when I'm about to hit the red line. You know, we are the next, you know, not Purim, but we are looking into the spring holidays and the special days that we mark in Judaism. And one of those days is Yom HaShoah. And every year, every one of us has his or her thing on Yom HaShoah. And my thing, ever since I was a kid, and I was born in Europe, I'm not Israeli. I've been living in Israel for the past 15 years, but I was born in Serbia, in Europe. My big thing on the Holocaust Day is always to ask myself, what would I have done? How would I have reacted? Would I have recognized that the Holocaust is happening? Would I have ran? What's the price I would have been willing to pay for freedom, for my kids, to run away, to escape? And this haunts me every Holocaust. And I want to believe that I would have saw it coming. I would have been ready to pay any price for the truth. And then October the 7th happened. And you know, 2 weeks, I shared some of my personal experiences with some of you here earlier. 2 weeks after October the 7th, I visited Kibbutz Kisufim. And I tagged along on a delegation of foreign journalists, so I felt very alone because they were all foreign journalists chasing a scoop. They were literally chasing a blood stain and chasing to shoot another bullet that the other one didn't shoot. And I felt alone, and I was wandering around, and none of them spoke Hebrew. And then there was Benny, the spokesperson of the Kibbutz Kisufim. And we started talking, and he shared a story of how his son survived with me. And he said, please don't tell it to anyone. He didn't want the journalists to know it. This is like 2 weeks after October the 7th. There was a smaller party, right? Everyone has heard of the Nova party, but there was a smaller one. And his son was there with his girlfriend. And because they were residents of the South, they had WhatsApp groups. And because they were already used to red alerts and rockets, and they had internal alert systems, right, of notifying each other what was going on. So they got a message that there were breaches by Hamas and that there were many terrorists in the kibbutz. And this young boy, with his bare hands, dug a hole in the ground and buried himself and his girlfriend. And I don't know how, but he found 2 straws. And he put the straws in the ground, and this is how the 2 of them were breathing for 6 hours, while hearing on the ground the shooting, the rape, the killing, the massacring. And the way that they found them is that Benny's other son, who was backpacking somewhere in the Far East, located his brother's phone with the GPS, and then they told the IDF where to dig them out. When I heard that story, I said to myself, this is Holocaust. These are the stories that we heard from the Holocaust survivors. These are the stories that we read about. Now, everyone told me, stop, Olga, you cannot compare what is going on now with the Holocaust. And you know what? Because they said it's demeaning, it's diminishing the magnitude of the Holocaust, the 6 million victims, and they're right. But I wasn't comparing the numbers. I stick to my comparison. I compare until today the feeling that each and every one of us had and continues to have. That sense of abandonment, that sense of loneliness, looking evil straight in the eyes and feeling like you're the only person because no one around you None of your neighbors, none of your friends, none of your colleagues, none of your campus colleagues, no one sees what you see so clearly. It's that horror in Benny's eyes that I saw of what he went through on October the 7th. And the horror of my 6-year-old boy when he first realized that there were hostages and that so many of them were kids. We didn't let them watch the news, but then we were taking a stroll down the Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv, one of the main streets, and there was on every bench a teddy bear and a picture of a hostage. This is how my kids found out. And the horror in the eyes of the innocent child, that was to me another reminder that this must be how they felt in the 30s and the 40s. This must be how they feared, not knowing what's going to come next, if we act or if we don't. But now, in a way, we have it worse. Because the one thing that the state of Israel was supposed to do is protect us physically. And this is what was shattered into pieces. But not only for us in Israel, but for every Jew around the world. Because it's not only the physical atrocities and the massacre that happened, the worst pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust on October the 7th. It's the unprecedented anti-Semitism and Jew hatred and violence against Jews that was unleashed, literally unleashed, around the world. I flew to Berlin in the first week of November to speak with the members of the parliament, only to be told by my Jewish colleagues that they are taking down their mezuzahs in Berlin. This was just a few days before marking the anniversary of the Kristallnacht. The Sydney Opera gassed the Jews, the masses were chanting. Everywhere around the world, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, as the slogan of justice and the slogan of liberation and protecting the unprivileged, the underprivileged. This was our reality. And exactly in this space, exactly in this feeling that we all share, that's where my organization resides for the past 20 years. Now, before October the 7th, and some of you heard me speak, I would say the same sentence. NGO Monitor is an Israeli-based research organization that works to defend Israel's right, bare right to exist as a Jewish homeland within the human rights space. But before October the 7th, I don't know how many of you would have understood it in that sentence. It would have taken another half an hour at least for me to explain what that really means. After October the 7th, how many of you do not understand? How many of you did not feel completely failed by the human rights community? Now, what does that mean? It's campuses, it's the parliaments, and every bill in the Congress that is being done in the name of justice and promoting human rights. It is the UN, it's UNRWA, but UNRWA, let me tell you, is the biggest one and the most notorious, but it's only one of the 24 UN agencies operating in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and West Bank. It is every parliament around the world. Every bill proposal, every legislation that is anti-Israel, trust me, is lobbied by the human rights activists. And every bill that is supposed to be pro-Israel is being lobbied against by the same groups. Now, who are the main messengers, turns out? So-called human rights NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Human Rights Watch. Anyone who hasn't heard of them? Of course you have. Amnesty International, Oxfam Lobby, maybe less here in the States, but it's a huge Christian aid organization. But then smaller ones that you might not have heard of before October the 7th, about the biggest Palestinian so-called human rights organization, Al-Haq, all the way to random groups like Kurve, a German NGO that not even a German person would have heard of. But the one thing they all have in common is they promote human rights by obsessing about us, by obsessing about Israel. And obsessing about Israel meaning not representing what goes on in our part of the world properly, rather working systematically in a coordinated and orchestrated campaign to delegitimize the right, the bare right of Israel to exist. It's not a partisan political issue. It is whether we have the right to be there or not at all. From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free is a call for destruction of the Jewish people and of the Jewish state. Now, a lot of these groups, too many of them, are actually funded with your taxpayers' money through official humanitarian aid, development aid, through programs that are supposed to promote human rights, humanitarian causes, build sustainable democracy, and help, well, it's aid around the world, but we're talking here about the Palestinians, supposed to help the Palestinians build a sustainable society of their own one day. The estimate is that since 1993, after the Oslo Accords, at least $40 billion in humanitarian and development aid went into the Palestinian society. The United Nations have requested from the developed, according to OECD, 30 developed countries, which basically means US, Canada, EU, European Union, and Nordic countries, Switzerland, Australia, and New Zealand. That's it. That's the 30 donor governments. The United Nations have requested for the last quarter of 2023 alone, right, for the 3 months since October the 7th, $1.2 billion in aid from the donor governments. That, after the war, is going to quadruple itself, if not more, because the political pressure will be immense to rebuild, to renew, to reestablish, and so on. What did the money go to? Let's put aside the money from Qatar and from Iran. That's way above my pay grade. I'm not an intelligence officer, I'm not a Mossad agent. I don't know. That's common knowledge. I have no knowledge. But what I know is that the evidence that has been coming out since October the 7th clearly shows that a lot of the humanitarian aid went to enable Hamas physically, because they stole it for the rockets, for the tunnels, they were stealing fuel, they were stealing medical supply, they were stealing humanitarian aid, for the love of God now, because they have to eat something in the tunnels, right? But that's the easy part. That's the most obvious part. There's a whole part of the humanitarian and development aid that is non-physical and non-materialistic. Did you know that advocacy, political advocacy, falls under the category of humanitarian aid? Meaning that when you pay taxes, and part of that goes to USAID, and then USAID goes and gives grants to organizations around the world, a lot of that money that you believe is humanitarian aid goes to political advocacy programs. So it can be a training session in Gaza on something. Now, what are the chances that they're really training civilians there? Let me give you an example. A Gaza-based organization called Phoenix Center in Gaza, that is currently enjoying a USAID grant, ran a workshop on IT literacy. But when we checked who sits in the workshop in the meetings, it was Islamic Jihad terrorists. And October the 7th, it wasn't only Hamas. It was Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Not even an Islamic organization. This is a communist Palestinian terror organization who was in charge of hijacking planes in the 60s and the 70s. But get this, they have a full-blown NGO network. We always say, like, you know, that it is a common knowledge that terror organizations abuse charities and non-governmental organizations because they're the easiest prey. But when it comes to PFLP, this Palestinian terror group, which U.S. also designated as a terror group, they have a political fraction, right? Because they're all political parties in the PA. They have the armed wing, the terror part, and they have the NGO network. They have a 13 NGOs network, all of them human rights organizations, and all of them getting money from the European governments. In 2019, there was a terror attack in the outskirts of Jerusalem. A father with a son and a daughter went on a stroll. And there was an explosive that was detonated, and a 17-year-old Rina Schnurr was murdered on spot. A few months later, Israeli security forces arrested a 50-people PFLP cell. Turns out that out of 50, at least 8 were senior employees, executive directors, CEOs, financial directors of Palestinian human rights NGOs, who at that moment were getting humanitarian and development aid from the EU, from Germany, from Sweden, from Switzerland, from Netherlands, and so on and so on. This, too, is humanitarian aid. A few years back, there was a huge thing. There was a huge Christian organization called World Vision. And they have operations in Gaza as well. Their Gaza director was convicted by Israel for embezzling $50 million from their funding, which a lot of it was either from governments or from donations, in order to give it to Hamas. And part of it, the indictment said, went to build tunnels and rockets. This happened in 2017. The conviction came in 2021. This is way before October the 7th. Now, because we don't have that much time, what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact, now I spoke to you about the smaller Palestinian organizations, but what do we do with the fact that Amnesty International just last week sued the Dutch government for what? The US government supplies Israel with F-35 components, okay? But some of these components are stored in the Netherlands physically, and UK. So Amnesty International and another 2 human rights organizations sued the Dutch government, forcing it to not supply the components to IDF. Why did they do that in the Netherlands? Because they know that it wouldn't hold water in the US. The first round they lost because the Dutch government fought them back. But then they appealed, and in the appeal court, Amnesty won. So there's radicalization on ground. We spoke earlier, I don't know where the professor of Holocaust is, we spoke about the dehumanization and demonization. We're talking about 30 years of humanitarian aid enabling, institutionalizing dehumanization of Israelis. Because they don't refer to us in textbooks or in their brochures or in their speeches as Israelis or Jews or anything else. They refer to us as the occupiers, the Zionists, the soldiers, the IDF, which completely, we cannot be victims. October the 7th did not happen in a vacuum. There's a reason why, beyond the terrorists who physically perpetrated the massacre, no one in the Palestinian society condemned it. No one, not one Palestinian or Gaza person said, I saw where they keep a hostage, or I saw something, or I want to escape. No one, nothing, zero. In The Hague a few weeks ago, right, South Africa, of all countries, sued Israel for genocide at the International Court of Justice. I mean, a joke. Who was sitting in the audience on the side of South Africa? You had someone from Human Rights Watch. You had the Director General of Al-Haq, the biggest Palestinian human rights organization, and heads of 2 other Palestinian human rights organizations. Al-Haq was the co-author of the claim of South Africa. And in the claim, in the lawsuit, there were 45 sources that led to Palestinian and other human rights organizations proof that Israel is perpetrating a genocide. Now, what is the genocide libel? It's upping the game from the apartheid libel. It's an exponential line. We have been systematically excommunicated from the human rights space. I call it the human rights space because it's so much more than just NGOs. It's so much more than 1 or 5 or 10 organizations. We have been forced to not feel welcome in the space where we, as members of the Jewish community, feel most at home. This is what our culture and what our religion teaches us. We were completely failed by the human rights community after October the 7th. The UN women, only yesterday, took them 5 months to say that yes, there was rape, but get this, but they will equally investigate the allegations that the IDF soldier raped Palestinian women. Like, I'm a woman, and I have to, every time I speak about this, I have to pause, because it is mind-blowing. It is mind-blowing. None of these so-called human rights organizations after October the 7th condemned the massacre. But mind you, they didn't condemn it. Many of them denied it. Many of them said it was fabricated by Israel in order to occupy Gaza. A woman running one of the Palestinian organizations, the organization is called Miftah, she called the rape crimes nonsense. And now when the UN women issued their statement, she tweeted yesterday that it is a disgrace. Why? Because the UN relied on Israeli official sources instead of UN independent investigators. We know how independent the UN investigators are. It took them 5 months to go and say something that it's common knowledge. We, at NGO Monitor, we're a small organization. We're 15 researchers based in Jerusalem. And we use open source methods, which is just a fancy word for Google. We Google and we document the examples of how these so-called human rights organizations distort the truth, lie, fabricate, promote anti-Semitism, have ties to terror. And then we take these reports to the donor governments. And we tell them, this cannot be. You're trying to bring about peace. You're trying to build democracy. You're trying to normalize the relations, right? You're trying to help the Palestinians. Even if you leave Israelis aside for a moment, you're trying to help Palestinians. Your money is doing exactly the opposite. But all that was until October the 7th. Now, I can tell you that the first reaction after October the 7th of all governments was to look into the money. Because they wanted to make sure that none of their taxpayers' money, including the US government, right, went, God forbid, to Hamas. Now that on its own, as a method of investigation, is a nonsense. I mean, Hamas issuing invoices or receipts, how do you even check that? I mean, I don't know. Would any government deliberately fund Hamas? Of course they weren't going to find anything, right? But they weren't looking into all the radicalization and the incitement against Israelis and Jews and anti-Semitism. And I'm not only talking about NGOs, I'm talking about the textbooks, the school books from which the Palestinian kids learn. Because these are the two faces of the same issue, right? Like, we have examples of a governmentally funded NGO that brings a program to a Gaza-based kindergarten. And my kid in Petah Tikva, when we have a end of the year theater play, which all of us parents are like, oh my God, why does it have to be an hour? But they sing and they dance, and there's every other word is shalom, is peace and love. These kids in Gaza, they had a mock-up play of taking hostages. And I'm talking about a few years back. half of the kids were dressed as Hamas terrorists, with the masks and everything, and the other half were dressed as Israeli soldiers. And what happened on stage is that the one half was abducting the Israeli soldiers. Now, then from that, they go to schools, and in their textbooks, UNRWA-operated schools, right? They learn in math. You know, one of the exercises is, if you see a settler walking on the street, under which angle do you need to throw the stone in order to hit him? This is a math exam. Then from there they go to university or they go to work in human rights organizations, but this is also what they hear. The only thing that they read in the media is the same narrative. So we are all working, basically fighting against the same lie. And what is the lie? It's at the end of the day, they don't want the state of Israel. It's not about the borders. It's not about this agreement or that agreement. It's about Israel's right to exist. So taking you back to what it is that we do. We go to the governments and we try to tell them, you're not funding what you think you're funding. Sometimes they're ideological and they are funding exactly what they think that they're funding. But then too, we need to fight them because that ain't right. Since October the 7th, our research helped cut 23 million euros, that would be $25 million, in funding to anti-Israel NGOs. This is since October the 7th. But you know, it's a nice number. I can stand here and I can wave at that number and it sounds impressive. That's worth nothing. Because after the war, there's going to be much more money coming in. No government will stop funding. EU just this morning announced that they're renewing funding to UNRWA. This is after 16 governments froze and are investigating, and we are already in that second wave, right? The first wave was, oh my God, shock, the atrocities, so many Jews died and Israelis. But now, as the images from Gaza are coming more and more, and the longer the physical war lasts, the more difficult it is for the politicians to actually act with integrity, right? So EU just renewed the whole package, almost 300 million euros. So what we are working on now is working with the governments to now, yesterday, introduce different policies. They need to figure out ways how to better do vetting and monitoring and sanctioning, how to condition the funding after the war. The aid will flow in. That's a pre-given. But we want them to condition it. We want them to say, on one hand, yes, of course, no money should go to physically supporting terror. No money should go to incitement to violence. No money should go to antisemitism. That's not enough. The new common denominator is, if you don't recognize Israel's right to exist, you are not a liable partner for our taxpayers' money. It's that simple. But then it's more than that. The international donor community also has to assume responsibility and accountability for the incredible amount of money. Money has power. It has taken 30 years for the Palestinian society to become radicalized, in Gaza particularly. Now they have to embark on a long-term project of de-radicalizing it, and they need to use aid as an agent of that. Then how do you do that? There's no other way. You cannot eradicate hate from overnight. In every society, there's hate, and there's always going to be hate. The difference between a democratic society and a non-democratic society is that in a democracy, a hater knows that he or she is breaching the law when they say it publicly. And that's what needs to happen in the Palestinian society as well. They need to learn by force in the beginning. I come from Eastern Europe. We went through the same thing after we became democracies, is that if you say out loud in the public space, or you're a teacher in a classroom, you're going to be sanctioned for it. And it takes a while, and it will probably take a generation. But that's the only hope we have for maybe one day, not peace. That's such a big word, too big for me. Just to be able to exist one next to another, with acknowledging the right of the other to be there. We don't have to love each other. That's too, that's too much. Now going back to the question, because I don't know, I'm probably short on time, right? And we want to open for questions. Going back to my first question, what I would have done. Because it follows me. It follows me every day. I wake up in the morning and I say, is this it? Is this like in the 30s? How do you know? Where's the line, right? When too much hate crosses that line of tolerable. And to my mind, the difference is that we today, we have a global and connected Jewish community, part in Israel and part around the world. And we must not be silent. We must not be silent. We have to tell the truth as it is. We have to call anti-Semitism out for what it is, in its simplicity. Before October the 7th, we had all these complex conversations. Where does criticism of Israel end and anti-Semitism begin? Is it anti-Semitism or is it anti-Zionism? We had 50 definitions of anti-Semitism, and once we pushed the whole world to adopt the IHRA working definition, we had 5 other definitions that basically define why the IHRA working definition is not the right definition. There's only one anti-Semitism, the oldest hatred in the world. It takes different forms and shapes, depending on the historical context. But the difference in 2024 must be that we have learned something from the history, that we have a strong country, and yes, we took a hit on October the 7th, and we paid the heaviest of prices. But IDF was back and running in relatively no time. And us in Israel, after 2 weeks, we regained the sense of physical safety. Because the first 2 weeks, we were all mortified that a Hamas terrorist is going to come knocking on everyone's door. And I live in Petah Tikva. That's not in the south. But what we have not won yet is the international battle for Israel's legitimacy. And if October the 7th has taught us anything, that is how fragile that is, and that we cannot take it for granted. That's where we reside, and that's what we fight for. We cut funding, we work to push the governments to change policies, because cutting funding is not the only thing. And it's the immediate action, and it's the welcome and the right action. But if you don't teach the system how it made the mistake in the first place, how it even came about to choose a terror-affiliated organization to promote human rights, then it will make a mistake again with another organization. So what we've been working on is systematically pushing the governments to adopt new policies, guidelines, legislations, whatever it is, restrictions, contractual conditions on how to better choose the organizations. We're not against the Palestinians. We're not against NGOs. But we demand the same transparency and the same accountability, like all of us here in the room, in our different spheres of profession and life, have to exercise on a daily basis. It cannot be that just by tagging a name human rights to your organization, you get a carte blanche to hate Jews. And it cannot be that when you do that, that is only further normalized. And that's what all of us are feeling after October the 7th. $40 billion in humanitarian aid since 1993. Let that number linger with you. That is crazy. Imagine what someone else could have done with that amount, and what kind of reality we could have had with a different neighbor. I want to thank you for giving me the time, and I want to open for questions. I'm sure you have many. Susie?
So I want to go to the question about the day after in Gaza, because that was part of the title for tonight.
So, okay, so maybe I should have, everyone talks today about the day after physically in Gaza, right? And it's a question of who will run it, Who will be the administrative entity? Will there be, to what extent will Egypt be involved? To what extent will the Abraham Accords countries take a role off the record, on the record, Saudi Arabia, the international community? But that is just Gaza. I deliberately framed the conversation tonight in such a way because, to my mind, there is another day after. And there's a day after for the international donor community and for the humanitarian aid. And that's what I tried to, maybe I should have framed it as such before I went into details. It cannot be that the billions of dollars that will go in will just unconditionally be delivered the same way and through the same partners like until now. It cannot be that we will continue to believe naively that humanitarian aid is only sacks of flour, and food packages, and concrete for building buildings and houses. I mean, we have to have learned something from everything that has happened. Now, again, to all of us working in research organizations such as mine, there's nothing new under the sun. The magnitude, yes, obviously. Questions, perfect. The magnitude, obviously, no one could have thought in the wildest nightmare what will happen on October the 7th. But the hate, the culture of hate that exists there, that is systematic across the Palestinian society, none of that is new. And I can't say that any of it came as a surprise. I also think that the anti-Semitism that was unleashed afterwards is but proportional to the magnitude of the massacre, right? When we have a regular round of rockets from Gaza, we have a certain amount of protests and a surge in anti-Semitism. But now, proportionate to the massacre of October the 7th, this went up as well. But what we cannot allow is to not change now anything and not sort of use. Unfortunately, we went through October the 7th. There's no way back. But what we can change is what we demand now of our respective governments vis-a-vis our taxpayers' money. And that is the day after that no one talks about. And again, we as the international community, we have very little control over money from Qatar and money from Iran. But we do have much more of a say on the billions of dollars that will go in through humanitarian aid. And we talk about the day after in that context. And we are working on we call it a policy paper, but it's this big manual basically with concrete recommendations, not only for funding NGOs, but for funding UNRWA, for textbooks, for different UN agencies, for humanitarian aid, human rights aid, and we will be representing it and presenting it to different governments, including the US administration, because we believe that if we have to initiate this conversation around the world, because it's not just one government. All of them have to pool resources, and they have to demand that the aid is more accountable and that there's more of an oversight. I'll read the questions, yeah. How do you evaluate the Biden's
administration?
Is it loyalty? No. Administration. It's not in favor, okay. Handling of this moment, okay. Specifically this week, airdropping food into Gaza, and Kamala Harris calling for a ceasefire. Okay. I'm not an Israeli official, so here's my personal take on this. The Biden administration has been the most amazing supporter of Israel since October the 7th. There's how immediately it came, Biden flying down, the speech that he delivered. I don't know what he did here to the members of the Jewish community, but the Israelis. We felt more leadership coming from DC than in that particular moment than coming from Jerusalem. So it was very, very significant. At the same time, I think no government is black and white, and no government is monolithic in its policies. And I think that Biden doesn't have an easy life within his own party. And given that it's an elections year, it's a catch-22. On one hand, it's supporting Israel and its right to defend itself. At the same time, there's no one right now internationally wants another war in the north with Hezbollah, which is it's a tricky question. We in Israel have the same dilemma. On one hand, we don't want more of our soldiers to die, and we don't want them to march into Lebanon, but at the same time, we have 150,000 Israelis who are still evacuated from their homes. And the people are reluctant to go back to their houses in the south, where we are, the IDF says, this close of defeating Hamas. And in Lebanon, we are nowhere near that. So what is it that would need to happen to guarantee 150,000 Israelis that they are safe to go back home? I mean, it might not look like it in the media, but it's a war in the northern Israel. And the only reason it's not being reported as such is because the civilians were evacuated. So that, in Kiryat Shmona and in some of the smaller cities, the destruction of houses is immense. But again, the civilians have been evacuated. So I think the fact that it's an elections year here in the US doesn't make it any easier. And a lot of this has very little to do with Israel. It has with much bigger global trends. But I believe that regardless of that, politics is never black and white. US has been the greatest ally of Israel, and we need to do everything in our power to make sure that that continues to be the case, whoever is in office. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we have is making sure and doing everything that we can that support is bipartisan no matter what, and not to fall victims as members of the Jewish community to the partisan politics in any one country, not only here. Okay, the airdropping into Gaza, it's a perfect example, right? It's the same like was the case with the hospital in Gaza in the beginning of the war. You have a situation where Hamas deprives its own people from getting humanitarian aid, and then convoys finally driving in, and then starved Gazans stampeding the convoys, and most of them died because they tripled or were ran over the trucks. But the world, without checking the facts, immediately blames Israel. Now, when it's our victims of rape crimes, right? Then it's a bad thing that the sources are Israeli official sources. When it's our IDF telling what we did, then it's bad. But then on the other hand, everyone using official Hamas figures is okay. Although Hamas is a designated terror organization around the world. So, there's I think there's no intelligent way to answer this question, but I think it epitomizes the essence of the challenge that we have, which is the bias across the board, and the abuse of the terms fighting for justice has reached its peak. When you call Hamas sympathizers justice fighters or liberation fighters, then you know that something has gone terribly wrong in this world. Okay, how can we help? That's an excellent question. And there's multiple answers to that. First of all, you can support us. I don't like asking for it, but I have to, because I have 15 full staff members who work day and night to do what they do, and we have some supporters here in the audience. like Harry and Susie and Susan, and we hope to have more of a community in Dallas. Ken Glazer was a supporter of NGO Monitor, so if anyone is interested, we would be more than happy. And the Golan family, sorry, I have, okay. You can also get involved with your local government. There's, it's one thing when I fly from Israel and then I say I'm an Israeli and I'm going to present facts and figures to you. Now, they cannot argue with facts and figures, but they can argue with how much of a case do I have. Because I'm not an American, it's not my taxpayers' money. But if you write to your representatives and you lobby your elected officials and you work through your Jewish organizations, so meaning you have organized power of the group, demanding that your government does a better job in choosing how it spends public money, who it spends on, and how it controls it, then it has a different, it weighs more, because they are accountable to you, not to me. So I think that's, and this is, by the way, the model that we apply everywhere in the world. We don't have offices anywhere around the world. We work with every pro-Israel or Jewish and non-Jewish organization who is interested in these topics. In the state, here in the US, we work with everyone from local JCRCs to APAC, who uses our research, right? And in every country in Europe, there's a handful of organizations, but at the end of the day, we provide the research, we provide the analysis and the facts and the figures. We don't pretend to be in the position to have the network or maintain the network or be as relevant to your elected officials as you are. So yeah, that's definitely one of the ways you can help. What publicity campaigns do NGO Monitor engage in? So we're not very good at that. I'll tell you why. Because we spend all our time researching and writing reports. And most of our funds actually goes either for researchers or to enable us to go to Europe and DC and Canada and meet with the elected officials. Oftentimes, more often than not, and the bigger the success, the more is the case, we're not going to say anything publicly.
Right.
The best way for any one government to do something is when it demands its own policies on its own. So we don't, we publish a lot. I just published an op-ed in JNS this morning on a more or less this issue. But we don't spend much of our budget on publicity. We are not a grassroots organization. Our job and our mission is not to raise awareness on these issues in the broader public. On the contrary, we are, we're like the elite units of the IDF. We go in and out. We see a challenge, we analyze it, we figure out how to regroup our troops in the most effective way, because we don't have that many. We go in, and we go out, and we go elsewhere where we are needed. And again, it's our target audiences are the elected officials and the policy makers, and the journalists and the media in a manner that they will make the topic relevant for the elected officials and the policy makers. Why has Israel not requested the help of UN or UNRWA for its refugees from Hezbollah attacks? Okay. This is another question. It's an excellent question. It goes straight to the heart of the problem. There's a UN agency for refugees around the world, and then there's UNRWA for the Palestinian refugees. I was a refugee once, okay? When I was evacuated from Serbia, and I was displaced. I spent 3-4 months in Hungary, and I was a refugee. If I would have had a baby, I was too young, but if I say that I had a baby in Hungary, my baby would have become a Hungarian. If you have a refugee here, the minute that their kid is born, they become US citizens automatically. They were born here. Not the case with Palestinian babies. When a Palestinian baby is born, they automatically become refugees. This is the only refugee community which multiplies itself. And UNRWA, in that sense, I said, UNRWA is only 1 out of 24 UN agencies operating there, but it is the most symbolic one because it is the main one that perpetuates a few things. The sense of the culture of victimhood in the Palestinians, instead of focusing on, whatever the solution will be. And again, it's above my pay grade, but working towards some sort of a solution, some sort of a better, brighter future. Instead of that, they are nurturing a culture of victimhood. They're nurturing an identity of refugees. And worse than anything, they are nurturing the myth of the right of return of all these refugees. Now, the right of return, much like the one-state solution, and much like from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, all means one thing: no Israel. And so there's no way that any official or unofficial Israeli would want UN to assist in anything. Israelis, but we just don't trust them. I mean, they were part of they were and they continue to be part of the problem. The UN Human Rights Council is one of the most anti-Semitic, bodies in the universe. We just spoke about the UN Women, right? And those are only some of the examples. Let's talk about UNICEF. Okay, UNICEF, most of you will know them as feeding the hungry children in Africa, right? UNICEF has a list of terror organizations. Do you know that a bunch of human rights organizations, Palestinian groups, have been working for years to try and put IDF on that list, together with Boko Haram and Daesh? This is UN. If anything, what needs to happen is a complete reform, a deep reform, restructuring of UN agencies and how they operate. UNRWA probably should not exist. Now, it's a simplistic thing to say, let's shut down UNRWA. Many have been saying that. In order to say that, we need to also be able to come up with what instead, right? Because there's a challenge on the ground, there's millions of people, and Israel does not want them on our budget or on our responsibility or administrating them. Israel has no interest in doing that. And probably there should be some sort of a strategic plan to decentralize the authorities that UNRWA had. The schools probably operated until now by UNRWA in Egypt or in Lebanon or in Jordan should fall under the authority of the local governments, right? And the same should be done inside of Gaza. There's no reason why UN agencies should operate schools. And the same systematic challenges with textbooks and the teachers can be solved if it's operated by a UN agency or operated locally. You're solving the same problem. And then other UN agencies should simply assume their respective responsibilities like they do in any other region, in any other conflict region, without UNRWA. That's oversimplifying it, obviously. But the question is not a practical one. The question is a political one. Because the international community also needs to say that they want to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And until now they haven't been. Until now they have been lending hand to perpetuating the victimhood, the right of return, and the refugee myth, right? And they have been allowing, in parallel, with money, but not only. Money is just the means. A much worse part is actually putting a blind eye, or this attitude until now, well, you know, a little bit of hate towards Jews is okay. It's part of the folklore. But it's not. We understand that words matter, and words lead to action. We had a conversation with Harry earlier about the hearing of the heads of the universities in the Congress, right? I mean, this is what it is. Does genocide constitute a breach of your code of conduct? Yes, if it leads to action. That's it. It's the same phenomenon across the board. We must not allow for actions to become the reality. We have to work at stopping them while they're still only at words. Those were the questions. I don't know if you have, yeah, I have another one.
The last one was my question. Obviously it was tongue in cheek. Obviously we will not do it. But if UN were given this question, they have to acknowledge that indeed communities were destroyed in Gaza, in border with Gaza. The people were, as you say, 150 or 250,000 are displaced. Why will they not deserve the help just like the Palestinians? They would have to acknowledge at the very least, yes, we need to provide help. That would then put us at least on the same level as the Palestinians. Officially. Okay, I know in reality it's not the case, but let them face the question and answer it.
I mean, I think if you try, I would be interested to see what happens. I don't even know how to, I cannot speak on behalf of the UN, but I think that much like the International Red Cross is yet to visit any of our hostages or provide medicine to any of them, chronically ill, wounded, and so on. I think in the same way we cannot really expect much of the UN. I rely on our own capacity for our own resilience. And I rely on our own capacity, Israeli and Jewish, globally, on rebuilding and renewing. And much of it has already happened. I mean, if there's one thing good that came in the aftermath of October the 7th, it's the incredible mobilization, bottom up, both in Israel. I mean, I don't know how many of you know, but in the beginning, the government was more or less paralyzed. Who ran the country? It's the volunteers. I mean, I was going through some of my Facebook posts today looking for a picture, and I was reminded that on October the 10th, I was on a bus from Tel Aviv, packed with volunteers, to the hospital in Beersheba taking food packages. And you know, we felt so important, you know, only to get to the hospital in Beersheba and see that we are hundreds, food, fruit, sandwiches, owners of coffee shops, name it. People were standing on the streets and handing things out to soldiers, to volunteers, to whoever needed it. We were, you know, I would receive a phone call, or there were things on Facebook. If you have room for anyone, register on an Excel sheet. There were endless Excel sheets with who have empty apartments or empty rooms to host immediately people from the south. The mobilization was incredible, and I saw the same coming from the communities around the world, and it happened instantly. And I think if there's one thing that we should take as a source of inspiration and hope after October the 7th is that sense of togetherness and the sense that it doesn't matter who's in power in Israel or anywhere else. We know better. And the force of the community, that's what we have. The community can change the reality. So that's my take on it. Oh, you want? Go ahead.
So going back to the question about the ceasefire, that was my question. So when people say we need a ceasefire, is that kind of code word for anti-Israel?
Sometimes it is, obviously. Sometimes it's just not understanding. It became a buzzword, right? Ceasefire, ceasefire. What does that mean? Like, we've been fighting there for 5 months now, right? And so many of our soldiers have died. And we still have 134 hostages in the tunnels of Hamas, or their bodies. We don't even know how many of them are alive and how many are not. What country, what normal, sane country would cease fire now? The international community should say the other way around. They should demand, Hamas, it's a terror organization, but they should pressure Qatar and whoever it is to release the hostages and then discuss the ceasefire. If they release the hostages, Israel would cease fire right away. We didn't look for this war. We didn't call for it. We didn't initiate it. But we're damn gonna fight it. And we're gonna fight it in Gaza, in the north if it takes, and we're gonna fight it internationally with whoever tries to undermine our right to be there. Because we are all refugees from somewhere, and the country was created as a refuge, and no one's gonna take it away from us. Now, when I go and speak to, I was in Berlin last week, speaking to members of the parliament, and it depends who you talk to, right? Just like here. So I had a meeting with a Green member of the parliament, which would, the American equivalent of that would be the more progressive parts of the Democratic Party. And he, because it's a German one, and there's more historical awareness and context there. So even he would say, Israel has the right to defend itself, and yes, the hostages, but the humanitarian disaster and the humanitarian catastrophe and the ceasefire. But when you ask them, but how would you do it? They don't have an answer. They don't have an answer. Now, that's when you can talk with a politician. But if you go to Ireland or Belgium or Spain or Norway, there's no one to talk to. The foreign minister of Ireland visited Auschwitz for the first time now on the 27th of January for the International Holocaust Day. And she said that for the first time she truly understands the trauma of the Jewish people. But even more so, she understands why there needs to be a ceasefire. And she just packaged it in the same sentence, which in a way makes it worse, right? Because what is it? That's one of the anti-Semitic tropes. Did you just compare Holocaust to what is going on in Gaza? But you can't expect more from
your point about Biden's in a tough situation, I think, is very true. And he didn't do very well in Michigan running against no one because there's a large Arab population there. And I don't know if Kamala asking for a ceasefire and then dropping food is sort of trying to placate that wing of the Democratic Party. You're right. I agree with you, and we see that also everywhere around the world. At the end of the day, politicians have to appeal to their constituency, and it's not only the Arab constituency. That's part of what we are discussing here is a global trend, right? Of hijacking the human rights conversation, hijacking the conversation and discourse with the younger generations, where they feel that the most important thing they can do and express themselves is to fight for the justice. They don't always know what that means, because when you ask them, from the river to the sea, when you ask them which river or which sea, they're clueless. I raise you that half of them probably wouldn't be able to find Israel on a map, on the global map. Gays for Gaza? I mean, seriously? I mean, but I don't think that they know what they're really chanting. They don't understand what they're really saying. What they do understand is a trend. They understand social media. They understand the trend that they need to fight for justice, and this is a cause. This is the trending cause. Now, the celebrities, Hollywood, there you would expect more responsibility, because they should know better. At least they should know better before they tweet something to double check it. But they don't, because many people are also, they're activists. Like all of us, they have opinions. So many of them are actually pro-Palestinian. Now, again, pro-Palestinian on its own is not a bad thing. It's okay. But not if it comes on the expense of the safety, security of Jews and Israelis. And this is, maybe I don't know if what's the time limit here, but I'm just going to finish with this. I think that's another thing, and when I go speak to elected officials, I say to them, don't change any of the funding conditions and policies for the sake of Israelis. Do it for the sake of the Palestinians, because you want to give them an actual hope. Some sort of democracy and a free society, but more so, do it for your local Jewish community. Because at the end of the day, when something happens in Israel, it's not us Israelis. Take for the moment the October the 7th, that we're not the ones suffering from anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism is a direct result of what goes on in Israel, is first felt around the world against the Jewish communities. Do we have time for another question?
Maybe the last one.
The last one.
Oh, thank you so much for wonderful question. You fighting all the organizations, Hamas and what? Who is most against this big?
So who's fighting us?
I mean, is it EU? Is there, NATO, whatever? US?
It's an uphill battle for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's very difficult to stand in a room full of human rights organizations and tell them that they have no integrity and that they are a bunch of anti-Semites. It's very difficult to even approach a journalist and then they interview someone from Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, and then they interview someone from NGO Monitor, and they don't weigh the same. Last year, for example, I don't remember where it was, but it was a local law association of lawyers. Okay, not a chamber of. What's it called?
Like a Chamber of Commerce?
No, not a chamber.
City Council?
Like a
Bar Association.
Thank you. The Bar Association, and they were doing an innocent thing. They wanted, someone tabled adopting the IHRA working definition. Now, the IHRA working definition, for those of you who don't know, stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition. And it has been adopted by like 30 governments around the world and hundreds of institutions and so on. And what it does, it's a working. Why? Because it's practical. And it has 7 examples attached to it. Half of the examples are examples of, far-right, neo-Nazi, and old-school anti-Semitism. And half of the examples actually have to do with Israel. Denying Israel's right to exist is to be considered anti-Semitic. Holding you guys guilty for collectively guilty for Israeli policies is anti-Semitic. Judging Israel by double standards that will not be applied to any other country is anti-Semitism. Comparing Israel to Nazism and to Holocaust is to be considered anti-Semitism. Now, once Human Rights Watch people realized that the Bar Association is going to do this, they went on such an aggressive lobby that in the end, the lawyers, they caved and they just dropped the whole thing. They didn't even trust themselves to go into a fight, to go into a debate and to argue, because the letter from Human Rights Watch arrived. Because when they issue a report, it is on the front page of New York Times. We are never going to get on a so.
No countries opposing you. No countries that preventing you. Jerusalem doesn't prevent you from going Gaza.
No, the Israeli government we don't work for the Israeli
I want
government.
them to support.
No. We also don't. We don't take any governmental money because we publish critical reports on how governmental funds are distributed. So we would, as a matter of principle, never take any governmental donation from Israeli government included. Now, in the governments around the world, it depends. The elected officials are much more open and receptive to what we have to say. The administration, less so, because they feel that we are criticizing them. So it's always the schism, right? Because the system, the inertia of the system is not to say, oh, I made a mistake. The inertia is to say, I didn't do anything wrong. You're wrong for accusing me. So it's an uphill battle, technically, because we're criticizing them, but also because we've been trying for 20 years to change a paradigm, to re-educate that UNICEF is not only feeding children, hungry children in Africa, that Amnesty International, with its reputation, does not do only good. And it's not an easy battle. Now, we've done a significant work because when our president and founder, Professor Steinberg, created the organization exactly 20 years ago, everyone said to him, you're crazy. Like, you're going after Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But today, there's not a single Jewish or pro-Israel organization, even before October the 7th, who is not fully aware that apartheid libel came from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and that they've been lobbying, that the ICC case against Israel was also lobbied by those and a bunch of Palestinian organizations. So we did change the discourse, but it's an uphill battle, and but we won't give up.
All right.
I see another one. But I don't
Thank
know.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.